Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is TK Thorne, retired Birmingham police captain and Birmingham historian. Thorne's most recent book is Behind the Magic Curtain: Secrets, Spies, and Unsung White Allies of Birmingham's Civil Rights Days. I spoke with TK Thorne in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. TK, it's nice to see you again.
It's lovely to see you again.
The last time we spoke, you had a couple of books under your belt, and we were in Monroeville, Alabama at the annual meeting, and we spoke about your book, Last Chance for Justice, and we talked a little bit about some of your biblical historical novels and
House of Rose.
and House of Rose. And we'll get back to House of Rose because at that time you promised there was going to be a sequel, and now I understand there is.
Yes.
But today's business is, in a sense, very serious business. A lot of people, and I think I would include myself, a lot of people think they know all about all there is to know or all they want to know about the civil rights movement in Birmingham. And it's just not true. It's so complicated, and there's so many people involved, and those people were interwoven, good people and bad people, and black and white, and clergy and laity, and it was a real tangle. So you have a new book about the civil rights movement, and it's Behind the Magic Curtain and Unsung Heroes. What, in the light of all the books that we are familiar with, what is the function of this one?
Well, first of all, it's called Behind the Magic Curtain because Birmingham, Alabama has a nickname of the Magic City, which has nothing to do with race. It is about the history of the city, which was not a city until 1870 when it became a boom town because of the confluence of the elements that are needed to make steel. And it grew so fast that it was called the Magic City. And so that's the reason for the title. And then Behind the Magic Curtain is precisely what you said, which is that we think we know what happened in the city, but there were so many things that were going on behind the scenes that were very important that have been neglected, I guess.
Well, it was a cast of thousands. There's a biography of Shuttlesworth. There's a biography of King. There are books about Bull Connor, but there can't be a book about everybody. But there are a lot of people involved. About the city of Birmingham, but before we leave that as an idea, I remember when I moved to Alabama 52 years ago, there was always this. I didn't know if it was true or not, but a kind of a truism was Birmingham could have been Atlanta. Birmingham could have been the hub city, the center for corporations within their southeastern headquarters. It could have been Delta Airlines. It could have been Atlanta. Now, I had no way of knowing that was true, but there's hints of that in your book. Why did Birmingham not become Atlanta and allow Atlanta to do it?
I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that the mining corporations and the production of steel was what drove Birmingham, what created it out of a cornfield, basically. And it was also, they were the people that controlled the city. And they did not, by they, I'm going to use the term big mules,
Sure.
which, so the big mules were the power brokers behind the scenes. And like today, a lot of the more progressive community lived outside the real city limits, because the city of Birmingham was blue-collar worker, and they depended, for their jobs on the big mules and their companies. And what the big mules did not want was for Birmingham to become what's Atlanta today, because they wanted to keep it basically a one employer town. Because if Birmingham started opening up to service type industries and other businesses, it would mean competition for the wage earners that were there, and that would drive the cost of labor up. And so that was the whole philosophy behind keeping Birmingham down.
So there really was a moment when, if Birmingham had been willing to build a new airport, Delta would have settled there, and all of our lives
would be very different.
would be very different.
Yes, and Delta, I think, was probably a key, because Delta had already negotiated with Birmingham, and they wanted to move the airport, which in Birmingham the airport is very close, like 10 minutes away from downtown. So they didn't have the runway to make it an international airport, but they made a deal with the city and said, if you will move it out a little further where we can have that, we'll make this our hub. Right. And then that set off the whole battle between the big mules versus those who wanted Birmingham to be more than it was.
And then running alongside all of this economic greediness and narrow-mindedness was the issue of race. Birmingham, early in the 60s, got a reputation as a pretty awful place. And the New York Times sent down a reporter, Harrison Salisbury, and his report back to America, back to New York, back to the rest of the country on Birmingham was an absolute atomic bomb. And I don't usually read things on television, but I didn't want to get this wrong. It's Birmingham, fragmented by the emotional dynamite of racism, reinforced by the whip, the razor, the gun, the bomb, the torch, the club, the knife, the mob, the police, and many branches of the state's apparatus. It just, this piece by Salisbury just condemned Birmingham, absolutely. And the response in Birmingham was huge. And now time has passed, and the civil rights movement follows this chronologically. Where I'd like to go with this is to the Birmingham News, to literally from this is a newspaper article in the New York Times, and it was responded to emotionally and every other way by Vincent Townsend, who was the editor-in-chief, yes, at the Birmingham News. All of Birmingham was in an uproar over this article. So now you studied this stuff in detail. Was Salisbury, was he 100% wrong? Did he exaggerate? Is he dead on? And why did the people at the Birmingham News not pick up this and run with it? Instead, they sort of fought it.
Oh, they absolutely fought it. They thought it was hyperbole and a disgraceful picture of Birmingham. The distinction I would like to make with that statement is there are a lot of truths in that statement, but he goes on to say that all this was like happening in the streets in front of everybody, and that really wasn't true. Right. These things happened, but they happened under the cover of darkness, and things perpetrated by the Klan. And so, the truth is a funny thing.
Yes. But historians seek it.
Pardon?
Historians seek the truth.
They do seek the truth. But, if I could sum up this whole book and all the research that I did, I can condense it into 2 words. It's complicated.
Yes, it is. All right. Over the many years that I've been studying and living in Alabama, one of the things that I notice pretty steadily is Alabamians can criticize Alabama a little, and Yankees should not criticize it at all.
Yes.
You don't want to hear about that. Patriots can become very defensive. And my question is really about the world of newspapers, about the race beat and Klibanoff, about the Birmingham News. Do you think that Townsend, did he do his job properly? He failed to report racial matters in Birmingham because it made Birmingham look bad. That's not what newspaper reporters are supposed to do.
It's certainly not what we think of as professional newspapers. Like everybody else, Vincent Townsend was a figure who, I would say, professional newsman was maybe 95% of who he was until the issue became his family, i.e., his city. And he loved the city of Birmingham. I don't think there's any question about that. And he wanted better for it, and he knew that Birmingham had to grow in terms of the type of businesses, in terms of equality and race relations. I believe that he personally felt that way. But it was like you said, it's his city and his town, and he wanted all those things because he wanted Birmingham to be better. But then here is this Yankee coming down and criticizing it in a way that he felt would handicap and hamper any ability to move beyond.
Right.
So
now, his right-hand man at the Birmingham News was Langford.
Tom Langford.
Tom Langford, who was started off as a very new reporter, really. And I'm reading along, and I was kind of puzzled. Tom Langford was devoted to Vincent Townsend, his boss at the paper, would do whatever Townsend wanted. And somehow or other, Langford got embedded in the office of Bull Connor, where he is reporting back to the paper, but it doesn't go in the paper. And I thought by the time I finished the book that I was very uncertain about the ethical codes of Langford, and in particular, he didn't invent wiretaps, but he certainly did.
He was cutting edge with it.
He was at the front end of that. Yes, he was wiretapping Bull Connor, Martin Luther King, businessmen, policemen, everybody. To what end? What was it that when you spoke with Langford? I know a lot in order to put that story in this book. What did he think he was doing?
You know, I struggled with that whole caricature of him and Townsend throughout this book. Sure. And I asked him just, point blank. He felt like he was one of the good guys.
Yes.
And I can see, having been kind of enmeshed in that time period, we forget what it's like to live on as history unfolds. Because we look back on that time period, he was living it. And at the time, and a point I tried to make in this book, because I suddenly realized that that people were in law enforcement were terrified. They were terrified
of
a race war. Okay, some still are. But Mississippi had happened, and if you read about what happened in Mississippi the year in 1962, it was a war zone there for a while. The Army had to be called in. Right. And Birmingham authorities, and by that I mean law enforcement and papers and businessmen too, were afraid that was coming to Birmingham. And that's why they sent Tom Langford, and they sent members of law enforcement to Mississippi, because they needed intelligence. They needed to know what was coming. And intelligence, and I mean that in the sense of information, was critical to them feeling like they could counter that. You know, and if you think back on what happened in Birmingham, there were some riots, there was violence, but not what it could have been. You never read about the Klan actually one-on-one confronting the marchers. That never happened. And that never happened in my best guess, because the police department was busy collecting intelligence about who was going to be where, when, and keeping that from happening.
So
for the most part,
some people,
not all the time.
Some people with the paper, who are also with the police department in a sense, were bugging the Klan.
Yes.
And how about Bull Connor? How does he fit into that?
It's complicated.
Which
I
side,
told you it was complicated.
You have the Klan and you have the police, and then you have the Commissioner of Public Safety. Where does he fit into it?
Right. Well, in the police department was complicated at that time. Everything is. So Bull Connor was basically a puppet of the big mules. Okay. He would never think of himself as a puppet. It was just what he thought. He was pretty pompous about his own beliefs and what he thought was right and wrong. However, he was definitely a man fully in support of segregation and keeping segregation. He was the commissioner. At that time, Birmingham had 3 commissioners that were the political.
Before they moved to the new system, which helped a lot.
Yeah, before the mayor council, which is a whole nother chapter how we got there. But the commissioner was over the police department and the fire department, which is why he controlled the fire hoses, the children. But and since the 30s, he had been in that position. But there was one period of time where he had to sit out of public office for 4 years, and that was because he was caught in the Tutwiler Hotel with his secretary. Oh, well. Yeah, and so he ran his gas station for those 4 years, and during that time, an extraordinarily progressive government stepped in, and the commissioner there hired a relatively progressive police chief to run the police department. And so when Connor came back as commissioner, he had this police chief he didn't like. And they were constantly at odds, and he tried to fire him. He drummed up about 40 different crazy charges on him and tried to get him fired. And the irony of that is that there existed at that time, as there does today, a merit board, which is the civil service institution that is sort of an appeal for law enforcement.
Sort of their legal protection against false charges of all sorts.
Exactly. It works on the getting into the idea is to try to keep corruption out of that office. And Connor actually had been involved in creating it when he was in the legislature many years before. But now they stymied his desire to get rid of this police chief, and he got very mad and he said, "Merit is what I say it is."
Yeah, things were a lot what he said they were. I don't want to go too far without talking about the people behind the scenes who for different reasons had their little shoulders to the wheel. People, progressives, we call them progressives now, liberals at the time, integrationists, some. That spectrum is interesting. At one end, you have these somebody like Sidney Smyer. That name, that name pops up in different books. He was a lawyer. He was a real estate mogul, right? Mm-hmm. He was a segregationist.
Absolutely.
And a racist, basically.
Yes.
Who wanted progress so that everybody could make more money.
Yes. That's exactly right.
So this is a sense of doing the right thing for the
wrong reasons.
Wrong reasons.
Yes.
And then you had, and then in the middle, we have saints as well, like Chuck Morgan and Berkowitz and so on. But in the middle, and I thought this was particularly complicated in a way, the families that own the downtown department stores. what an awful position they were in. I mean, you should be saying this, not me, but they were caught.
Caught in the middle, absolutely. Yes. So the downtown merchants were primarily Jewish, the people that owned those businesses, and they provided goods for the black community. And therein is why they were kind of targeted, because, in 1962, there was the Miles boycott, and they were targeted because that was a place where black people could make a dent, or
They could bring pressure to bear there.
They had influence because they were customers.
Right.
And so they got caught. But Dick Pizitz had a beautiful statement that kind of sums it all. He said at one point during the demonstrations, he was going to the Pizitz building, and down one block were the black protesters, and down the other block were white protesters protesting the black protesters. And there the building was, right in the middle of everything.
And the families that owned the department stores were at least open to hiring blacks at higher levels, integrating the dressing rooms, letting people try on shoes and dresses, and the water fountains and the toilets and so on. But every time they moved in that direction,
Bull Connor chopped them.
Yeah. I mean, it was fantastically. It was a kind of a weird trap they were in. They wanted to do the right thing in a sense. Well, if in their case, for the right reason and for monetary reasons. Then you got sort of, and there are two communities that are not financially connected to the civil rights movement in a sense. There's a Jewish community and a Unitarian community, and these were more or less, I mean, their motives were more or less pure. They saw this as an ethical, moral problem or issue that needed to be solved. What do you suppose is going on there? And especially, why Unitarians? You have high praise for a whole lot of Unitarians. Was there a community there that had a little push?
Well, I'm Jewish,
yes.
So I'm going to address the Jewish part first.
Sure.
This was only 15 years since the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. So that was still fresh on everyone's mind, and the Jewish community had a lot to lose because they were in limbo themselves in the South. Mm-hmm. Some of them, people considered them almost white.
Oh, sure,
almost,
sure, yeah.
And so that almost was a very, gray area, and they, it was, many of them felt if the community itself came out in mass, it would do no favors to the movement, the black movement, because it was already a Jewish communist plot.
Right, yeah.
And B, it could put them at risk of being further ostracized. And they, at that time, again, with the comment about when you're in the middle of history, you don't know what's going to happen. Right. You don't know if the Holocaust is going to happen again or something along that path. So they had that kept them operating, and they did things, but they did it behind the curtain.
Yes.
Okay. The Unitarians didn't have that issue.
Right.
And, you ask me why they were such leaders and so different. And, this is my personal answer.
Sure. Well, you've been studying it for years, so let's have it.
I think religion got in the way of doing the right thing. It's particularly in Birmingham. I know that sounds crazy. For a lot of the established Protestant religions, there were some exceptions to that, and which I note,
yes.
and they were all the more beautiful and brilliant for their exceptions. But in general, there was the feeling that religions and ministers in particular, because those were the leaders, the people that wanted to do more in many instances, that their congregation wanted them to stick to in church.
Gospels.
Ch-
Yes.
there was this divide between social issues and religion.
Right.
And I think that was something that, even to this day, you can see it
Oh yeah.
in many ways. I don't want to get real political here, but
Well, it's this is political historical, but what something that I need to be reminded of, and I've been reminded of it a couple of times recently, is that Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail was written in response to letters written by clergy in Birmingham who were worried about things happening too fast, about the pace of things, and called for patience and called for reconsideration and committees, what have you.
and to wait for the movement that was going on to replace Bull Connor and replace a form of government. That was going on at that time, and they felt like that was going to get
But
missed.
those
for
were the
their reasons.
hierarchical religions as well, the Methodists and so on, who had church structure, and the Unitarians
They didn't have that.
not so much.
It's all about how you treat each other for Unitarians.
It is, there's no bottom to this. There's no end to this. As you go through the book, as one goes through the book, you just keep finding individuals you never heard of before who did something quite brave in that moment, who did something, that they didn't ask for credit, and they didn't get any either at the time.
Right.
Or maybe didn't really even want any. We only have a minute.
Okay.
I'm interested, a few years ago, I read a novel of yours, The House of Rose, which is a kind of a fantasy. Does it have witches in it? And it takes,
Police witches.
yes, and it takes place basically at the foot of Vulcan, and there's stones with magical powers and God knows what. And at the time, I remember speaking with you about it, and you saying there was going to be a sequel, and now there is.
Yes. House of Stone is out.
And when and where is it set, and what happens, so to speak?
Well, you have to read it.
Well, I will.
Yes. There are 3 novels. All 3 of them are finished. House of Iron is the 3rd one, and it will be out, I'm told, in February. So we don't have to wait as long. We had a pandemic between book 1 and 2, and it kind of set things back. But I wrote those books. Those are my fun books that I wrote primarily for myself. And as I was writing them, I was wanting to entertain myself and not do a lot of research, because I had a lot of projects with research.
I'm sure you won't mind if I mention this, but I asked Toni Morrison one time, why are your books so complicated? Why are they the way they are? And she said, well, Don, I have to amuse myself. And,
exactly.
And any number of writers will tell you that they're writing to amuse themselves. Well, I'm going to be amused by House of Stone.
Yes.
And when somewhere down the road, you and I will speak again.
I would love that.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure.